With the goal of trying to provide more educational resources for businesses handling hazardous wastes, the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services Hazardous Waste Management Bureau has created a series of presentations that deal with different aspects of hazardous waste management. For businesses that create or handle hazardous wastes, knowing and understanding the rules around managing it legally is critical to compliance and environmental protection. This presentation is about determining if a waste is a regulated hazardous waste. To figure out if you make hazardous waste and what regulations you have to follow, you've got to know what a hazardous waste is. This presentation is intended to give you a start toward understanding what can be a pretty complicated topic. In other words, this is the short version. If you want an explanation that's a little more detailed, I suggest you check out DES's YouTube channel for our 10-part video playlist on hazardous waste determinations. Figuring out if you have a regulated hazardous waste is what we call doing a hazardous waste determination. We follow a series of steps to decide whether the waste meets any of the reasons we have for calling it hazardous. These 4 steps or questions are: is it a waste? Is it exempted from the rules? Is it what we call a characteristic waste? Or is it something we refer to as a listed hazardous waste? So the first step in the waste determination process is to identify what wastes you have. Now, we went over this in an earlier presentation, and hopefully it helped you find the wastes you make at your site. Once you have a list of items to review more closely, let's move on. And if you watched our video titled, "What is a Waste?" you remember that some wastes are used and probably easier to recognize, but that they can be unused too. Keep your eyes open for those less obvious ones. The second step is to review your waste to see if any of them are exempt. That means that for one reason or another, they aren't regulated, even if they might be dangerous. No, we aren't crazy. It may be exempt because another environmental program already regulates that stuff well enough, so we don't need to add the burden of hazardous waste rules. Or it may be that the waste is very recyclable, and regulating it as a hazardous waste would make it difficult to recycle and not really benefit the environment. Whatever the reason, there's a list of about 50 different exemptions in the rules. To review these exemptions, you can look at ENV-HW 401.03 through our website. And if you have trouble finding our rules on the website, give our helpline a call at 271-2942 and we'll give you some assistance. All hazardous wastes are identified with something called a waste number. You'll put these waste numbers on your waste containers and your shipping papers. These are mostly for the benefit of the business that receives your waste after you ship it off-site. These places are known as treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, or TSDFs. They have their own regulations to follow, and these numbers tell the TSDF what's dangerous about your wastes, and therefore what safe and legal options they have for disposing or recycling them. Almost all waste numbers start with the letters P, U, F, K, or D, followed by 3 numbers. For example, P042, F003, and D001. Now there are a couple other wastes that are identified with the letters NH followed by 2 numbers, such as NH O2. How do you know what waste numbers to use? One way is to see if they are characteristic wastes. These wastes fail the standard we set for some dangerous property or characteristic, such as being corrosive or catching fire easily. These wastes have waste numbers that start with the letter D. There's another group of hazardous wastes known as listed wastes. There are 4 lists of dangerous chemicals in the hazardous waste rules. Almost all of these chemicals are on the lists because they're toxic. A waste is a regulated hazardous waste if it contains a chemical on one of these lists and meets some other requirements. On one of these lists, all of the chemicals are given a waste number starting with the letter P. On another, all the waste numbers start with the letter U, and so on. Because of this, the 4 different lists are called the P list, the U list, the K list, or the F list. Now, in addition to these characteristic and listed wastes, there are a couple of wastes that might not be considered hazardous by some states, but they are in New Hampshire. These New Hampshire-only wastes have their own waste number that starts with the letters NH, followed by a 2-digit number. Let's look at these listed and characteristic wastes in more detail, starting with the characteristic wastes. We've gone through 2 steps of our waste determination so far. We've asked, is it a waste? And is it exempted? The 3rd step I want to talk about is determining if your waste is a characteristic hazardous waste. Again, characteristic is the term we use to mean that it has a dangerous property. There are 4 dangerous properties that we worry about: ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity. A waste is a hazardous waste if it fails the standards for any of these characteristics. So the question is, what are the standards? How ignitable is dangerous? How corrosive is dangerous? How reactive is dangerous? And how toxic is dangerous? Fortunately, we have answers. Let's look first at ignitability. When we say ignitable, it means that it's something that catches fire easily. But how easily is easily, right? Our rules say that if it's a liquid and has a flash point of less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit, then it's ignitable. Great, but what does that mean? What's a flash point? Well, a flash point is figured out in a laboratory where liquid waste is heated up and someone tries to set the vapors coming off the liquid on fire. The hotter it gets, the more vapors there are. If heating it gives off enough vapors so that they catch on fire or flash, they check the temperature of the liquid. If it's less than 140 degrees, then the liquid is ignitable. Not all wastes are liquids, though, are they? Solid can be ignitable too, although these aren't as common. Generally speaking, an ignitable solid is something that can catch fire through friction, and then once it catches fire, it really takes off. A lab will usually measure whether it burns vigorously by seeing how long it takes for a long strip of the stuff to burn from one end to the other. Certain metal powders, if the metal is pure enough and fine enough, can catch fire with frightening results. There are some materials, such as propane, that the U.S. Department of Transportation identifies as flammable gases. If you have any of these flammable gases on site and their wastes, remember, we only regulate wastes, then we would call them ignitable hazardous wastes. Lastly, there are some other chemicals, such as higher concentration hydrogen peroxide, that are called oxidizers. These chemicals can give off oxygen to feed a fire, even if there's no air, which makes them pretty dangerous. These are considered ignitable and they're a waste too. Here are a couple of symbols to help you identify these things. If you see these on containers in your facility, consider whether they're wastes or not. If they are wastes, they're probably regulated as hazardous wastes. Here are some common examples of ignitable hazardous wastes. As a general rule of thumb, if a liquid waste evaporates fast, there's a good chance it's an ignitable hazardous waste. Remember that we worry about igniting vapors, so the more vapors there are, the more likely it will ignite. Look for warning words on the container label, such as flammable, to give you clues to whether it catches fire easily. Auto body shops using paints are a very common source of ignitable wastes. If you've ever walked in an area where painting is going on, you're likely familiar with how much vapor there is in the air. Oil or solvent-based paints aren't used by just auto repair businesses, though. They're found in a lot of industries. Again, look for warning words and symbols on container labels to tip you off that these things may be regulated. As mentioned in our earlier presentation, take a very close look in flammable cabinets if you have them. These cabinets become catch-alls for dangerous materials since employees look to put dangerous stuff in a safe place. Flammable cabinets are also a favorite place for DES inspectors to look for violations. Adhesives are one more common waste stream that's often ignitable. We put adhesive on something and the liquid portion quickly evaporates, leaving the sticky part behind. Well, the evaporating part can often catch fire easily. Our second characteristic, or dangerous property, is corrosivity. These are wastes that are very strong acids or very strong basic chemicals that can react with other materials and damage them. These are common industrial chemicals with the potential for serious harm. We've all heard of incidents where people have received acid or caustic burns. Usually, a chemical is measured as a hazardous corrosive waste by looking at its pH, using a pH meter or a pH paper test strip. If the pH is lower than or equal to 2.0, we say it's a strong enough acid to be a hazardous waste. Also, if the pH is higher than or equal to 12.5, we say that it's so basic, so caustic, that we'll regulate that as a hazardous waste too. Measuring pH is only possible if the waste has water in it, though. If a chemical doesn't have water in it, there won't be a pH. But that doesn't mean it can't be corrosive. While not that common, there are some other corrosive wastes that can't be measured with pH, so a different lab test has to be used where they measure how fast it corrodes steel. Do you remember when I mentioned the waste number NH02 earlier? Well, in New Hampshire, we also regulate wastes that are a corrosive solid. There are some materials, such as water treatment chemicals, that are in solid form, like powders or pellets, and when mixed with water, have a very high or very low pH. Since they can even absorb moisture out of the air, protecting yourself from these wastes isn't necessarily as easy as keeping them away from water. Here on the right is a scale to help you see what is considered a strong acid and what is considered a strong base. You can see that a pH of 2.0 is about as acidic as lemon juice. A pH of 12.5 is somewhere between ammonia and lye, A couple of pretty harsh chemicals. On the left are a couple of symbols that can help to tell you if a material is a danger because it's acidic or basic. If you see these symbols on packages or containers, look closer to see if they would be considered a corrosive hazardous waste. In this photo, we have a metal plating line, a common process that makes corrosive wastes. The processes here can use both chemicals that are very strong acids and chemicals that are very caustic to treat metal or plastic parts. Here's a picture of a very corrosive solid that's destroyed the container holding it and is spilling onto the floor, and an example of a typical pH test strip that you can use in your own facility. The third characteristic to review is called reactivity. Fortunately, most of us don't run into these wastes, but it's still important to understand them so you can identify them if they do show up. There's a few different reasons that a waste can be reactive. First, these wastes are often considered to be chemically unstable, which means that they can explode or react violently with only a little bit of energy added to them. Some wastes only need to be bumped or even have a cap or lid removed from their container in order for them to explode. Some materials, like dynamite, are designed to do this intentionally. But there are also certain chemicals that degrade or change into new, more dangerous chemicals when they're stored for a long time and can eventually become shock sensitive. A couple of examples of these would be old ether or crystallized picric acid. Other wastes are considered reactive if they react badly when they come into contact with water or air. Now, we're all aware of some chemicals that don't get along with each other, right? One example would be mixing bleach with ammonia, which would make deadly chlorine gas. But water and air are almost impossible to avoid. If you have a chemical that reacts dangerously if it mixes with water or air, you're going to have a really hard time keeping it safe. Should you ever stumble across an old container of something packaged in oil, it might be a reactive waste. The good news is these are really uncommon. One last type of waste worth a quick mention is one that has enough cyanide or hydrogen sulfide in it that it would pose a danger to human health. Again, these, fortunately, are not common. On the left is a U.S. Department of Transportation symbol used to identify a material that would be reactive if it was a waste. I don't think you need me to tell you this is dangerous. On the right are some old containers of sodium and potassium metal contained in jars filled with oil. These two metals in their pure form, along with the metal lithium, can pose a serious risk. If you run across something like this, don't handle it. Instead, call your emergency responders and DES immediately. So far, we've looked at the hazardous characteristics of ignitability, corrosivity, and reactivity. Our last of the four hazardous characteristics is toxicity. There are 40 different metals, pesticides, and other chemicals that are hazardous only if they're found above a regulated concentration. The concentration is different for each metal or chemical and can be found in the New Hampshire Hazardous Waste Rules. These regulated concentrations are very small, in the part per million range, because we're worried about these getting into groundwater and the harm they could do if they made it into people's wells. One example is lead. We all know that lead is dangerous, and it's one of the metals in the toxicity characteristic. And we regulate it if a test shows that it's just 5 parts per million or more. A special test is used to measure that concentration called the toxicity characteristic leaching procedure that can only be done by a qualified laboratory. It's designed to figure out how much of the bad stuff, in this case lead, would leach out if the waste was buried in the ground, such as if you had wood with lead paint buried in a landfill. This is one reason why a business needs to be really familiar with the wastes that it makes. It's not always that easy to know if your waste contains very small amounts of these dangerous metals and chemicals and would therefore be regulated. You have to look closely at the ingredients in the products you use and what contaminants might be getting in there when you use them too. For instance, processes that use acids or bases can corrode plumbing, and the metals in the plumbing can get into the waste. Another example is a process where there are moving metal parts that can wear down over time, and the metals again contaminate the waste stream as it's created in the process. This slide shows a screenshot of some of the toxicity characteristic metals and chemicals and their waste numbers. The column on the right shows the concentration at which we worry about this stuff. We use the term milligrams per liter, but if it's easier for you, you can call it parts per million. There are many possible toxic hazardous waste streams, but here's just a couple possibilities to consider. Metals are often used as part of a chemical that gives paints, dyes, and inks their colors. While manufacturers are getting better at making coloring agents that don't contain regulated metals, some still do, and you'll want to keep your eyes open for them. There are also some fairly common chemicals that are toxic that aren't metals. A couple are methylethyl ketone, or MEK, and perchloroethylene, also known as tetrachloroethylene, which is a common solvent in spray can cleaners. That takes care of our third step. Is it a characteristic waste? So let's move on to our fourth and final step. Is it a listed hazardous waste? You'll remember that I said there are 4 lists of chemicals that are regulated if they're in your waste and meet some other criteria. They're known as the P, U, K, and F lists. Of those, 2 of them, the P and U lists, describe chemicals that have never been used. Examples of these might be a gallon of paint thinner that you will never use because you don't do the process that needed it anymore. Or it might be something like a product on a retail store's shelf that's damaged or past its expiration date. It's never been used, but it's still a waste if they can't sell it. The other 2 lists of chemicals, known as the K and F lists, describe chemicals that have been used in a process at a business. These chemicals are regulated not just because of the type of chemical used, but also because of the way that they were used at the business. One common example of this would be waste toluene that was used as a solvent. It would have to be the chemical toluene, and it would have to have been used as a solvent to be considered a listed hazardous waste. So used and unused. A waste can be either one or the other, but it can never be both. If your waste is used, you don't have to worry about the chemicals on the P or the U list. On the other hand, if your waste is unused, you do have to worry about the chemicals on the P and the U list, but not those on the K or the F list. Again, the lists of regulated unused chemicals are the P list and the U list. The P list is special because it's reserved for the most dangerous chemicals. those that could do serious damage in even very small quantities. These are the acutely hazardous wastes I mentioned in an earlier presentation introducing the self-certification program. Many of these are medicines or pesticides, very helpful in the right amount, but deadly if they get in the wrong place or in the wrong amount. The U list, on the other hand, is for chemicals that are also toxic, but not quite as bad as those on the P list. Remember that in order to be regulated, these chemicals must be unused. If it has gone through a process, it can't be a P or U listed waste. Here's a screenshot of a small section of the P list. You can see that they're identified as acutely hazardous in the title. There's some pretty exotic and hard to pronounce chemicals here. This is a screenshot of a section of the U list. While these chemicals look pretty intimidating too, they're a little more common. You may recognize acetone on this list. It's a common solvent, and if disposed of when it is not used, it can be a U-listed hazardous waste. Fortunately, most businesses don't make P-listed acutely hazardous wastes, but if you work in the healthcare industry or you have a laboratory, the odds are more likely that you do. A couple of common examples shown here are warfarin, a common blood thinning medication also known as Coumadin, and nicotine, used in the vaping industry. Remember, make sure you take a thorough inventory to identify your wastes and any products you have that may become wastes later on. You want to be careful to identify these wastes because of their danger, but also because of the way they can impact how you're regulated. Also remember from our earlier presentation that you only need to have 2.2 pounds of acutely hazardous wastes to become a highly regulated hazardous waste generator. We've talked about the first two lists that describe certain chemical wastes that have not been used. Now let's take a closer look at the other two lists that describe wastes that have been through a process, that are used, the F list and the K list. The F list describes certain chemicals that, when used in certain ways, are regulated regardless of how concentrated the chemicals are when you're done. In the New Hampshire Hazardous Waste Rules, there are 28 different wastes on this list. Of those, however, there are 13 that are way more common than the others. The first 5 F-listed wastes, that is, numbers F001 through F005, are chemicals that have been used as solvents. These are by far the most common F-listed wastes, and if you work with solvents, you want to pay close attention to the descriptions of these wastes in the rules. The second most common are those described in F006 through F019. These wastes are made through chemical metalworking processes, that is, using chemicals to add material to or remove material from a component, such as in industrial plating or etching operations. The last of the 4 hazardous wastes is the K list. These wastes are made by only 13 types of businesses, only a few of which occur in New Hampshire. However, one type of business, foundries, that pour molten metal into forms are capable of making a couple of these wastes. We do have several foundries in New Hampshire, and if your business has this type of process, you should become familiar with those K-listed wastes. Here's a few examples of where a small generator might find F-listed wastes. The first is spray can cleaners. These cleaning solutions often used chemical solvents that fit the descriptions for F1 through F5 wastes. The same is true with spent thinner. This third photo shows a solvent still. If you have a solvent recycler at your facility, be aware that the residues left behind in the unit may be regulated as F01 through F05 wastes too. Lastly, this photo shows a typical metal plating operation, a common process that can create F006 through F19 wastes. That's the last of our 4 steps of a waste determination. Here's a small sampling of typical hazardous wastes made by 4 different but common types of businesses. If your business is one of these 4 types, this can give you an idea of things to look for that might be hazardous. Both auto body shops and printers frequently use significant amounts of solvents. These are often ignitable, and some wastes may also be toxic. Healthcare businesses are likely to have unused listed wastes, but can also have a fair amount of ignitable waste because of the alcohol and some other solvents they use. Manufacturing industries are very variable in what they create, but they're the most likely to generate ignitables and corrosives. Toxic characteristic wastes are also common at these facilities. It might be difficult to be accurate with your waste determination, but that's why we're here. While it's ultimately the responsibility of the business to get it right, we're available to help you in taking the right steps and getting the right information. You'll need to pull together all the information you have about your wastes to come to a decision that you have confidence in. That includes documentation such as product labels, safety data sheets, previous test results, and your own knowledge of what happens in the process. In some cases, the only way to know if your waste is hazardous is to have a laboratory test it. In any case, file that information away so you can prove how you made your decision if asked. If you feel it isn't worth the cost of a lab test or the time to research deeply if a waste is hazardous, you can be conservative and call it hazardous waste without proof. But you'll still need a good idea of why it's hazardous. What waste numbers could apply? And guessing that your waste is not hazardous is a bad decision without some background documentation like what I just described. If you, or worse, an inspector find out years after the fact that you illegally disposed of a hazardous waste, you may be assessed a fine. And nobody wants that. Honest. Figuring out if you have a hazardous waste is a pretty intimidating thing, and it may be that you'd just as soon avoid it and plead ignorance. Unfortunately, we already know that's not a successful defense. Instead, if you'd like help with identifying if your wastes are hazardous, here are some resources available. That wraps up our brief introduction on determining if your waste is a hazardous waste. If you'd like a little more detail on this topic, don't forget you can review our 10-part waste determination series on our YouTube channel. We also have more presentations to help you understand these and other regulations. But if you'd just like to talk to a person, you can give us a call at one of these numbers during normal working hours. Please leave a message if we don't connect, and we'll return your call. If email is your preference, you can reach us at sqg@des.nh.gov or hwcomp@des.nh.gov. unused.gov.